Watch full episodes of the Cali Gas Podcast and subscribe to our channel now.
I hear lots of talk these days about my rights. And I'm like, where is the conversation about your responsibilities in all of this?
Definitely.
Like, these things should basically be going hand in hand. It's a lot of entitlement. And so, maybe to give some people the context that went into that whole thing, I look at one of the biggest deficiencies in government being that people can spend money that they have no personal accountability for that money, right? So in that situation, what is your incentive? Your incentive is to spend money to get what favors you, which basically means to buy votes, right? Because of this, there is a natural tendency towards a huge lobbying industry. Because, hey, listen, if I know that I can get you to spend money, which costs you nothing, on my interests, then paying basically for you to do that has a big ROI. And you can go and you can look into details on how lobbying actually has a really good ROI. Basically, if businesses could spend more money on lobbying and continue to have that scale, they would do it all day long. So it's one of their best investments. That's really, really negative for a country. You don't want to have a situation where all of a sudden you have basically people trying to stand in between. It just creates this whole system of rent seeking, right? Because the most profitable thing to do then is to sit next to the person with the money printer and have them hand you the money, as opposed to trying to create real value, as opposed to trying to produce productivity. And I don't know if it was in that set of tweets or another one that I did around the same time, but I was making some comments about how we have this issue of growing the size of the pie versus fighting over the share of the pie that we have. And if you're in a situation where you have an expanding population and the pie remains the same, and by the way, very important distinction between the amount of money and the amount of real goods and services. The real pie is the amount of real goods and services, not the amount of money. So you can increase the monetary supply, but the actual supply of goods and services remains constrained. You're still fighting over the same pie. So the only way for us to all win is that we grow the pie. And so then you can start saying, okay, well, the most basic question should be, what do we do to grow the pie? How do we kind of build a system that incentivizes that? How do we build a system that creates innovation? Of course, we need to have some preservation mechanisms in there because we don't want to, try and grow it and then just kill everybody. And, that's not growing the pie so much. It's kind of a bad thing. So, how do you build a system that goes that way? And to me, this is like a system of accountability, a system where there are constraints at a personal level, because I don't really buy this kind of institutional accountability thing. What do I mean by that? The idea that you can hold an institution accountable is kind of bullshit to me, because at the end of the day, people care about themselves. And if the institution gets punished, but it doesn't affect them personally, who cares? You have to bring accountability down to the individual level. That person needs to be like, their head is on the chopping block if something goes wrong. And at the same time, listen, if I'm making a loan, I should be accountable that if that person defaults, I'm the one who's left holding the bag. Because otherwise, what happens? Well, I'm incentivized to just give loans, which is basically what happened leading up to the financial crisis in 2008, right? You had basically all these banks who would just go and sell loans. Then they would go and package them up into mortgage-backed securities, and they would sell them to Iceland or to whoever else, people who couldn't possibly have the resources to dive into the details behind these loans. And so as a result, they were all left holding big bags. Lots of bonuses got paid out to mortgage brokers and to Wall Street bankers and all these kinds of things. And a bunch of other people got screwed. Terrible for the system, terrible for most of the players in the system, great for the rent seekers who were just going to basically prey on all of that. And you don't want that. You want a system where those people are accountable for what it is that they sold. And I think if you just introduce that, because now it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. And there's also a degree of, because we exist in networks, there's a ripple effect of our behaviors. And so how we account for that ripple is fairly challenging. That being said, if you start with the basic premise that, hey, listen, people should be accountable for their own stuff, and it should they should feel the downside as well as feel the upside. I think that that's the baseline of creating an incentive structure that leads towards people producing productivity that then has some downward outfall.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. And I think one of the biggest ways that we lost accountability, at least within the free market, is, like you said, lobbying, and then also the money printers. So like you said, like the big companies, it's not about making the best product anymore. It's not about being the best. It's about being best friends with the money printer and,
Yep.
being the first guy in line. Um, that's something that a lot of people, especially in the free market group, people who advocate for free markets, I think people are kind of wising up to it now, but, they'll be like, I can't think of an example right off my head, but they'll be like, well, why would Microsoft do that? Or why would this company do that? It doesn't make sense. It's like, cause they're not operating, they're not in competition. They're trying to get money printer money. Like they're trying to get bailouts. They're trying to get lobbying done. So I think that's one of the biggest, ways that we kind of lost accountability there. And do you think that the free market can provide all the accountability that we need, or do you think we need a justice system? We need somebody to kind of make sure contracts are upheld if somebody kind of like doesn't uphold their end of the bargain.
Yeah, so this is a really good and interesting question. So I sometimes frame it as, I have a bunch of very libertarian friends, and libertarians are probably like my favorite people because they're a lot about kind of personal responsibility. And I think that's like a great foundation point. That being said, I think that that mindset tends to be a little bit naive in terms of elements of how the world works. And what do I mean by this? In my view, the two biggest problems or the key problems facing our world today are the simultaneous effects of scale and complexity. So, you can say something like, oh, hey, well, the free market is going to decide that this airplane company is going to have good safety measures because if they don't, people won't fly it. But the problem is the average person is so far removed from the safety measures of an aircraft that they're not going to be able to make an intelligent decision on that until it's too late. And gradually, even if it started that the incentive structure, post some crash or whatever, was to run your airline really safely, and at some point you're going to start saying, hey, we can cut our costs if we can decrease our maintenance, and that's going to allow us to sell tickets for cheaper, which is going to cause us to get more customers, which is going to cause us to make more money. That's like the path you're naturally going to go down. And so because of that, you need to have some mechanism there that addresses these complexities that individuals can't handle on their own. Does that need to be a government or something? Not necessarily. Like I think one of the things that's really interesting in crypto is that you can sometimes handle that with code. And I'm really optimistic that in certain fields, I don't think that aircrafts are necessarily the best example of this, but I do think that debt is probably one of the best examples of this. You can handle it all in code, and you don't have to have a regulating authority. This being said, I also think there's a really important thing that seems to get lost in these conversations. I'm not quite clear about why, which is there's this opposition between like government and free market. And what people fail to realize is that government is part of the free market. Like if you just go and have a baseline society where it's like tribal, right? Everyone for themselves, what you're going to find is that people are going to start to coordinate because there's a payoff of coordination. And what is a government if not some sort of consensus decision-making structure to help people to coordinate in a particular way? Like that's just what happens. And naturally you start to get ripple effects and outfalls of this. I remember when the Enron stuff was going on and they were basically screwing over the California people. And so they had all these rolling blackouts, even though there was tons of energy production in California. Basically they would call up the power plants and say, hey, we don't have much demand on the grid. Can you shut the power plant down? They would drive up the prices of electricity and then they would turn it back on in order to profit. It was criminal. Like there's no way this should have been allowed. And when George Bush was asked to intervene at the time, he said, oh, I believe in the free market. The problem is in a truly free market, if you want to say that, hey, listen, no government, whatever, then what really happens is people who are pissed off go down to that power plant, they shoot those people, they take over the plant, and they turn their power back on. That's a truly free market. But that's, we've kind of built these layers of abstraction because we know that's not really the most effective way of dealing with it. So I think that it is very important to have some kind of government or governance structure in place and some sort of justice system in place. To me, the big point is it's extremely important. As soon as you do that, you have limitations on that and you have checks and balances. And one of my big fears in the world today is that those checks and balances have been eroded. I think one of the things that the US did pretty well on founding was that the founding fathers realized, like you'd hear some comments, I forget, was it John Stuart Mill? anyway, one of the founding fathers commented on how you can end up with this dictatorship of the majority. And you don't want a dictatorship of the majority. The whole point is that, or a tyranny of the majority. You don't want the masses to be able to override the freedoms of the few, which will inevitably happen if you leave that unchecked. So they designed, they have a Bill of Rights, and they have these, limitations on the power of government. They have, the executive branch and the legislative branch and the judicial branch, partially to try and separate that. And it actually worked pretty well in the sense that, okay, it's, like around 300 years later, and it still has, some semblance of working. Good on them. I think, though, that we've seen a lot of erosion, particularly since 9/11. That would be kind of, to me, the biggest turning point. Although there have probably been many of them, right? You can probably go back and you can say, okay, well, I don't know, the introduction of the Fed and, then World War II and the Cold War, there's probably some progressive intervention that happened there. But I don't think that it's good. I think that it's really, really important that the starting point of every law, of every government body, et cetera, should be like, hey, how are we limiting this? And what are the checks and balances on that power to make sure it doesn't get out of control? And today, I just don't see that average people have levers they can pull if there's some sort of a problem that's going on at the government level.